Imagine a world that voluntarily stopped the hands of time. A world where, for 250 years, the drums of war remained completely silent across the sprawling lands. There was not a single foreign invasion to disrupt the peace, and absolutely no radical new ideas were allowed to shake the deep, ancient foundations of this rigid society. Welcome to Edo, Japan, in the pivotal year of 1853. This massive, sprawling urban maze is the very same city that we know today as modern Tokyo. In the mid-19th century, while Europe was choking on the thick, suffocating coal smoke of the rapidly expanding industrial revolution that was changing the globe forever, and while mighty steam trains were already slicing across vast continents and telegraphs transmitted messages at the speed of light, Japan lived inside a perfect, hermetically sealed capsule. This was the defining era of Sakoku, the Great Isolation. Under strict, unforgiving penalty of death, the Japanese people were legally forbidden from ever leaving their island nation. Furthermore, foreigners from the outside world were entirely forbidden from stepping foot onto its sacred shores, keeping the threatening noise of Western progress completely at bay. The only exception was Dejima, a tiny, heavily guarded artificial island in Nagasaki, where a select few Dutch merchants conducted heavily restricted and strictly controlled trade. But Edo in 1853 was no frozen, sleepy village. It was in fact one of the largest, most vibrant and complex metropolises on the entire planet. Over 1 million diverse people called this sprawling urban maze home, moving together in a synchronized daily rhythm of commerce, tradition, and strict social order. If you suddenly found yourself standing on its streets, your senses would be instantly overwhelmed by the sheer magnificent scale of human activity unfolding around you. Unlike the cold, rigid stone labyrinths of London or Paris, Edo was an endless, flowing sea of warm wood, delicate rice paper, and elegant clay tiles. The heavy air was thick with the scent of fresh tatami mats, brewing soy sauce, charcoal-grilled eel, and the salty breeze blowing in from Tokyo Bay. You would hear the hypnotic, rhythmic clatter of thousands of wooden getter sandals striking the densely packed dirt roads, echoing between the tightly built merchant shops. These wooden sounds mingled with the ringing bells of heavy handcarts and the energetic shouts of street vendors selling fresh river tuna and steaming hot noodles. The people surrounding you looked completely different from anyone else in the world, living their daily lives under a system of flawless, unbreakable social discipline. This was an absolute hierarchy, meticulously crafted and ruthlessly enforced for generations by the powerful Tokugawa shogunate to ensure perfect harmony and absolute control. Standing proudly at the very top of this social pyramid were the samurai. Though by 1853, these fierce warriors had not fought a real war in centuries. They had transformed into highly educated bureaucrats, philosophers, and administrators, maintaining order through complex paperwork rather than bloody battlefield combat. Yet they still proudly carried their twin swords, the long katana and the short wakizashi, tucked into their belts as the ultimate, deadly symbol of their elite status. Men wore the traditional shomage hairstyle, featuring shaved foreheads with oiled top knots, and dressed in crisp silk kimonos and wide, pleated hakama trousers that commanded immediate respect. Just below the noble samurai were the hard-working peasants. They were considered the vital backbone of the nation, feeding the entire country through back-breaking agricultural labor. They cultivated rice, a crop so incredibly valuable and essential to the economy that it functioned exactly as actual currency to pay taxes and stipends. Further down the ladder were the talented artisans, the master craftsmen who spent their entire lives perfecting a single, breathtakingly beautiful trade. They created flawless lacquerware, vibrant ukiyo-e woodblock prints that captured the imagination, and the absolute finest, most delicate silks imaginable. And sitting at the very bottom of the official social ladder were the merchants. But right here lies the great hidden paradox of Edo society. Though officially despised by the strict system as mere parasites who produced nothing themselves, the merchants secretly held all the real, tangible wealth in their hands. They lived in flashy luxury, sometimes forced to hide their expensive silk garments under simple cotton cloaks to avoid angering the proud yet deeply impoverished samurai class. It was merchant money that sponsored the spectacular kabuki theaters, where heavily painted actors performed intense, emotional dramas of forbidden love and tragic duty. They also generously funded the red light districts like Yoshiwara, a shimmering, illusory floating world where geishas dictated the absolute highest standards of fashion and art. It was the 8th of July in the year 1853. The air was thick with the heavy, sweltering heat of a typical humid summer day along the Japanese coast. The villagers of Uraga were going about their daily routines, completely unaware that their isolated world was about to change. Then, strange silhouettes began to pierce the light ocean mist. These were not the elegant, fragile wooden Japanese junks with their familiar rectangular sails. These were massive, monstrous vessels, driving forward straight into the opposing wind. From their towering iron-black smokestacks, thick, suffocating pillars of dark smoke erupted violently into the otherwise clear and pristine blue sky of the bay. The local fishermen dropped their nets in absolute, paralyzing terror. In a culture steeped in mythology, this sight was entirely beyond their realm of comprehension. Many of the terrified locals believed they were witnessing floating, erupting volcanoes, or perhaps angry ocean dragons rising from the depths to breathe black fire upon the land. These were the infamous Kurofune, the Black Ships. It was a heavily armed naval squadron from the United States of America, commanded by Commodore Perry. The flagships of this squadron were the absolute latest in steam frigate technology, deliberately painted a sinister, pitch-black color to protect their wooden hulls from rotting. For the Japanese, whose largest permitted vessels were merely fragile coastal trading boats, the sheer towering scale of these steel and wood leviathans was entirely unimaginable. Even more terrifying was their armament. They carried 73 heavy naval cannons, fully capable of firing explosive shells that could turn any coastal fort to dust. The ships dropped their heavy iron anchors directly into Edo Bay, blatantly ignoring the strict Japanese laws that required all foreign vessels to sail to the distant port of Nagasaki. Word of these monstrous black ships reached the inner walls of Edo Castle with the terrifying, unstoppable speed of a raging forest fire. The sprawling metropolis, which had lived in absolute safety and comforting isolation for centuries, was instantly plunged into a state of deep, primal panic. Heavy signal bells began to ring relentlessly across the entire city, their deep, haunting tones warning millions of people that their peaceful world had been breached. Inside the sacred shrines, Shinto priests and Buddhist monks immediately began performing emergency prayers, desperately calling upon the gods to send another divine typhoon. Meanwhile, the proud samurai, whose ancestral armor had been gathering dust in cedar chests for generations, feverishly began cleaning their tarnished swords and donning their stiff, heavy plates. A fierce economic chaos instantly gripped the city. The price of essential rice skyrocketed in a matter of hours as the entire population braced for the absolute end of the world. The wealthiest merchants, terrified of naval bombardment, frantically began digging up the floorboards of their shops to bury their gold deep within the earth before fleeing to the mountains. Within the impregnable walls of the castle, the mighty shogunate was completely paralyzed by fear and indecision, unsure of how to face an enemy with such overwhelming industrial power. Adding to the severe crisis, the ruling shogun himself lay gravely ill, physically incapable of providing the strong, decisive leadership the frightened nation so desperately needed. The government advisors were suddenly trapped by their own centuries-old propaganda. They had always taught the people that foreigners were dirty, primitive barbarians. But now, these supposedly primitive barbarians were sitting right in their harbor, confidently commanding fire-breathing machines of death that defied the very laws of nature. When minor Japanese officials bravely rowed out in their small wooden boats, shouting demands for the fleet to leave immediately, they were met with silent, humiliating rejection. The American sailors simply used long wooden poles to casually push the tiny Japanese boats away, completely ignoring their authority. Commodore Perry refused to even show his face. Understanding the strict Japanese hierarchy perfectly, Perry remained locked in his cabin, declaring he would only speak to the absolute highest-ranking officials of the state. To break their spirit, Perry ordered his massive warships to pivot, pointing their dark, gaping cannon muzzles directly at the fragile, undefended wooden buildings along the shoreline. And then, under the guise of celebrating the American Independence Day, he ordered a massive blank volley to be fired simultaneously from all of his heavy guns. The sheer, concussive roar of the cannons was so violently powerful that it tore the delicate paper shoji screens of the nearby houses straight off their wooden frames. For the proud samurai standing on the shore, gripping swords forged by ancient masters, that deafening industrial thunder was the ultimate death knell for their entire way of life. Having delivered his terrifying message, Perry lifted his anchors and sailed away, leaving behind an ultimatum and a cold promise to return next year with an even larger fleet. Commodore Perry kept his chilling promise. In 1854, he returned to Tokyo Bay, and this time his squadron of black ships was even larger and more heavily armed. The Tokugawa shogunate, realizing the absolute impossibility of resisting steel cannons and steam engines with simple bows and katanas, finally surrendered to the demands. They signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, the very first of what would become known as the Unequal Treaties. The ancient gates of Japan were suddenly and violently torn right off their hinges. Soon, entirely new foreign quarters began appearing within the sacred, previously untouched cities of the island nation, drastically changing the visual landscape. Tall men wearing heavy woolen coats and top hats began marching confidently through the streets of Yokohama, demanding extraterritoriality and ignoring local customs. For the Japanese people, this was not just a political defeat. It was an incredibly deep and profound spiritual humiliation that shook the very core of their identity. In this exact moment, the heavily strained society finally cracked, instantly turning a tiny, quiet fracture into an unbridgeable, violent abyss of civil unrest. This ushered in the chaotic era historians call Bakumatsu, the absolute end of the once mighty shogunate, where all previous illusions of peaceful stability completely collapsed. Lower-ranking young samurai, especially from the southern provinces of Satsuma and Choshu, boiled with uncontrollable rage over what they saw as national treason. They had been raised on the incredibly strict honor code of Bushido, believing their sacred duty was to protect the divine emperor at all costs, even with their lives. Watching the shogun bow down to the demands of foreigners, they immediately labeled him a weak and unforgivable traitor to the nation. A fanatical new battle cry violently echoed. Honor the emperor, expel the barbarians. The quiet streets of Kyoto, the ancient capital where the emperor resided, quickly transformed into a terrifying battlefield of shadows. This was a brutal, unforgiving time when sudden death could easily emerge from any dark, unlit alleyway at a moment's notice. Young radical warriors, dressed in traditional cotton kimonos and armed with razor-sharp blades, launched a bloody, relentless campaign of political terror across the city. They actively targeted and assassinated shogunate officials, supporters of opening the country, and even foreign merchants right in the broad daylight of the capital. In swift retaliation, the terrified shogunate created the Shinsengumi, a squad of elite, ruthless swordsmen wearing distinctive pale blue coats to hunt down the rebels. They heavily patrolled the streets of Kyoto, answering terror with even more brutal, uncompromising terror, turning the city into a war zone. During this incredibly dark era, the night air constantly smelled of rain and burning wood, while the sharp ringing of steel became a terrifyingly normal background noise. Citizens were absolutely terrified to leave their homes, intimately understanding that their old peaceful world was violently agonizing toward its absolute end. But soon, this blind, sword-swinging fanaticism violently collided with harsh, unforgiving industrial reality in a way the rebels never expected. In 1863, radical samurai from the Satsuma domain assassinated a British merchant, sparking a massive, deadly international incident. In immediate response, a powerful squadron of the British Royal Navy approached their capital city of Kagoshima and simply erased parts of it into dust using heavy naval artillery. A year later, a similar devastating naval bombardment was unleashed upon the rebellious Choshu domain, completely shattering their defenses. Standing in the smoking ashes of their wooden cities, the radical samurai experienced a moment of brutal, life-altering clarity. They realized the great spirit of Yamato and the legendary sharpness of a katana were completely useless against rifled guns and modern explosive gunpowder. To successfully expel the barbarians, they finally understood that they needed to become exactly as strong and technologically advanced as the barbarians themselves. Yesterday's fanatical isolationists secretly began purchasing massive quantities of decommissioned American rifles and heavy British cannons through underground markets. In 1868, the boiling tension finally exploded into the Boshin War, a brief but incredibly bloody civil conflict that would decide the fate of the nation. It was a surreal battlefield where entirely different eras violently clashed. Shogun loyalists charged in ancient horned helmets, while imperial rebels fired modern Gatling guns. The climax arrived when the emperor's modernizing army marched directly on Edo. The massive wooden metropolis faced total fiery annihilation. It was the year 1868. A completely new era dawned over the world, known as the Meiji Restoration, marking the start of enlightened rule. The young emperor and his advisors, mostly former rebel samurai, looked at the world and saw a truly terrifying picture of vast colonial domination. Unlike other Eastern empires that desperately clung to their ancient past and perished, Japan made a cold, highly pragmatic decision for survival. It had to catch up to the West at any cost. What happened next has absolutely no parallel in all of recorded human history. Japan decided to completely break itself apart in order to be reborn. The old battle cry was permanently replaced by a new state motto: enrich the country, strengthen the army. In just a few incredibly short years, the visual landscape of the entire nation changed far beyond recognition, marching rapidly toward modernization. The government issued a strict decree banning samurai from carrying their iconic swords in public spaces, stripping away their ultimate symbol of power. Traditional hairstyles with shaved foreheads became objects of public ridicule, swiftly replaced by short, modern European-style haircuts across the country. Aristocrats who wore the finest flowing silk for generations now choked in stiff woolen suits and tall top hats, mimicking London gentlemen to appear civilized. The great samurai class, warriors whose ancestors inspired sheer terror for centuries, was officially and permanently abolished by the very state they created. Many proud warriors were forced to become ordinary government clerks, disciplined army officers, or struggling businessmen just to survive the new era. But the most massive changes were happening in the economy and the physical landscape. Wooden Japan was rapidly being covered in cold metal and red brick. The new government took on the absolute role of the main engine for rapid industrialization, heavily funding massive factories and complex infrastructure. Where porters once carried palanquins up narrow mountain trails, massive steam locomotives now rushed through, belching thick black smoke across the valleys. Space drastically narrowed, and time heavily accelerated as the ambitious nation raced relentlessly toward a highly mechanized industrial future. Textile factories in Osaka and Tokyo filled with thousands of young Japanese women, whose grueling, repetitive labor became the very foundation of the country's new capital. The new government completely understood that simply buying foreign machines was only half the battle. They needed to completely rewire the mind of the entire nation. Thousands of promising students were sent abroad to the United States, France, Prussia, and Britain to deeply study modern science, engineering, and law. Japanese elites walked through the loud, soot-covered factories of Manchester and the massive shipyards of Glasgow, meticulously documenting every single gear and rivet. They brought this vast ocean of knowledge back home, highly determined to perfectly recreate Western industry on their own native soil. It was a colossal psychological shock. An entire nation had to safely digest in 2 decades what took Europe centuries of the Enlightenment to achieve. And miraculously, they succeeded. Driven by the absolute terror of being colonized, Japan achieved the seemingly impossible and secured its independence. By the end of the 19th century, Japan had forever shed the heavy stigma of a backward feudal society and stepped into the light. It had rapidly transformed into a modern, incredibly powerful industrial empire, completely ready to directly challenge the greatest nations on Earth. The illusory, frozen floating world of Edo had completely burned away inside the roaring furnaces of the new, unstoppable steam engines. But the fierce spirit of this proud nation did not disappear into the ashes. It was simply and effectively reforged into unbreakable steel. This is the incredible story of how a locked door was violently kicked in from the outside by a changing world. But the highly resilient people trapped inside used the splintered wood to build a mighty ship capable of conquering the entire ocean.